Mothman. Perhaps you remember it. Perhaps you don't. Either way, it doesn't matter. After all, I do. In the winter of 2011 to 12, there was a string of disappearances on Newfoundland Island. The missing people all lived in remote communities of about 20 people, barely qualifying as villages. They had all gone outside during blizzards, and everyone believed they had wandered off into a whiteout and got lost in the storm. None of their bodies were ever found, and the fact that more than 2 feet of snow had fallen on top of them didn't help. Anyway, onto the part of the story that involves me specifically. I lived in a small community of about 37 people. One of the missing persons was a member of our small hamlet. It happened during one of the worst storms of that January. Despite our warnings, the man in question pushed past us like a man possessed, screaming something about the need for food and needing to go up. All but 5 of us never saw that man again. They were the lucky ones. By the 3rd day after he had left, it was light enough and clear enough for us to go outside. We were in the middle of a valley surrounded by 2 high ridges, and the snow was about 4 feet high. However, when we cleared away most of the snow from the single road going through the town, we saw that the snow was only that deep in the middle of the valley and manageable on the mountains. Given his previous statements, we thought this was a reasonable place to begin looking. 5 of us returned to our respective homes to get mountaineering equipment and weapons. As we left the comparative safety of the village, we climbed up the mountain and were approaching the peak when suddenly something leaped out of nowhere onto one of the members of our group. I pulled the .358 Magnum revolver from the holster strapped to my side and shot the creature on the back of my companion. The bullet went straight between the eyes of the beast, and I could see that it was a wolf. The dead creature fell limply off the man as he stood up, shaking the snow off himself. I could hear the gunshot echoing between the walls of the valley. I knew I had made a mistake as soon as the corpse fell off him. There were waves of snow traveling at unbelievable speeds down the mountains toward us. The noise of the wall of snow was deafening, and I yelled for everyone to brace for impact. I saw 2 of us swept away by the snow as I hunkered down, experiencing a limbo like nothing anyone who hasn't been in that position could know. I had to keep my eyes shut as tight as I could, and when I did open them, all I could see was a blank white nothingness. I could hear nothing because my ears were filled with snow, and eventually, I realized that the movement had ceased. I knew what I had to do in these circumstances, so I released my bladder and felt it move toward my feet. I breathed a silent thank you that it hadn't been the other way around. I moved my hands to my head and started to slowly dig upwards. Progress was slow, but I eventually clambered out of a small hole as the thick snow caved in behind me. "Hello!" I yelled, despairing. Suddenly, I noticed a flash of bright orange down the mountain about 500 yards away. It was Teller, a man from New York who had been living in the village for about 2 months. I didn't know much about him, but I liked him nonetheless. He was wearing a high-visibility coat, and I was glad of it. He was waving and yelling, and I saw the avalanche rumbling on behind him. I put on my snowshoes and walked briskly toward him. I pulled him out of the snow and helped him put on his snowshoes. We decided to walk together on the same level, looking for the other members of the group. First, we found the body of one of the group. His airways were full of snow, and we decided he had suffocated. "Nasty way to go," commented Teller, "but I've seen worse." "How so?" I asked him. "I served in Vietnam as a medic, you understand." I was about to tell him I did when I saw something that caught my eye. There was a person lying on his side about 300 meters above us. I started up the mountain, Teller following me. It was Jackson, the 4th member of the group. He was unconscious but alive, and we wasted precious time waiting for Jackson to wake up. Suddenly, he started coughing, and lumps of snow came up along with a small amount of blood. We trekked on for about another half hour, looking for the 2 missing people. It was getting dark, and there was the sound of wolves baying for blood, so we started down the mountain. It was discouraging, to say the least, having lost 2 members of our party and not having found the first missing person. That last point was about to change. The sun was setting behind the crest of the ridge when suddenly I saw a red tinge on the surface of the snow. I pointed it out to Jackson and Teller, and we started digging down through the snow. We only had to dig about 2 inches before we saw the lifeless, frozen face of Farmer, the original missing person. He was almost as white as the snow he lay on. It wasn't just that he was cold. It was as if the color had been sucked out of him. We excavated the rest of him from the icy shroud that surrounded him and discovered the gruesome truth of his death. His chest had been ripped open with inhuman strength, and his heart, clearly visible, was intact except for a single hole punched straight through the middle of the organ. When we inspected the other wounds, like the ones on his hands, defense wounds, Teller said, they appeared to have been made with claws, and they were completely devoid of liquid blood. We knew this couldn't have been done by any non-intelligent being. The wound on the heart, and the fact that when the chest was ripped open, there was no damage to the heart, confirmed this. But the wounds on the arms and the act of sucking blood from the heart seemed to suggest that this wasn't human. We were right. We knew we couldn't take the body with us, and it was approaching complete darkness. We all had maglights and weapons, a 12-16 shotgun, an M15 rifle, and my .358 Magnum. But we could see that whatever had killed Farmer, we had to choose the flight option. We left Farmer's body and started skiing. We had switched from snowshoes to skis after the light began to fade. We were now in the shadow of the opposing mountain wall and had to switch from our heavy handheld maglights to smaller, less powerful LED headlamps. It was a horrific experience, and we could all feel the eyes of some all-seeing, malignant presence watching us. Jackson wasn't paying attention to where he was skiing, and he suddenly fell, tripping on a rock that was somehow on top of the snow, almost as if it had been placed there. As the light of his headlamp swung around, I caught sight of a creature. It leaped on Jackson, clawing at the arms he had put up to defend himself. It reached toward his chest, caught hold of both of Jackson's shoulders, and using a dexterous claw on its foot, similar to that of a velociraptor, it slit open the flesh in the middle of his chest and sternum. With immense bestial strength and a roar of animal rage, it thrust its hand inside the wound, pulled the flesh apart, creating an explosion of blood, and leaned forward toward Jackson's still-beating heart. I should probably back up for a moment and describe the creature. It was about 7 feet tall, with light gray skin stretched taut over its bones and muscles. Its eyes reflected red in the light, and it had claws on its hands and feet. The claws on its hands were significantly smaller than the talons on its feet, presumably to help with maneuverability. But 2 features made it even more terrifying. Its mouth was like a rotting hole on its face, ragged at the edges, with a needle-sharp proboscis that was revealed when a flap of ragged flesh was raised. However, I've saved the most extraordinary feature for last. On its back, it had 2 large wings, each bigger than me. They were like butterfly wings, but more drab, like those of a moth. Anyway, back to the story. Jackson was still screaming, and the proboscis of that wretched creature was still approaching his heart. Time seemed to slow down as I thought about the missing people. I realized that this creature was responsible for all the disappearances and deaths. They had occurred every 3 days, which had to be how often it needed to feed. That's when I knew what I had to do if we were to have any chance of survival. I reached for the holster strapped to my leg and lined up the sights on the .358 Magnum. I pulled the trigger on the revolver. I shot Jackson in the heart. The creature screamed and leaped at me. I fired off the remaining 4 rounds of the Magnum. One must have hit its stomach, as gallons of human blood spilled from the wound. The other 3 wounds oozed a translucent blue liquid. It tried to take off, but Teller shredded one of its wings with a couple of slugs from the 12-16. I ran to Jackson, tossing away my Magnum and picking up the M15 rifle from beside him. The beast, though injured, screamed with a final roar and rushed at Teller. I shot it in the back, and a fountain of blue splattered Teller's face. It fell over and Teller stood up, looked down the barrel of the 12-16, and shattered the creature's skull. We looked at each other, shook our heads, and in silence, walked back down the hill toward the village. The next day, we returned to where the bodies of all 4 people had been. We found them all, but the body of the Mothman, I had searched the web for similar creatures, had disappeared. His blood was still there, and we sent samples to labs. After the burials, I moved. Teller had a job offer as a surgeon in Point Pleasant, and I decided to move with him. After all, I had no family there, and I wanted a fresh start. Besides, Teller was my only real friend, and the only one who would believe my story. But this was not the end. I suspect that the creature had a level of telepathic power, which it used to lure its victims to him, and that it had a family. I think, as it was dying, it sent an image of me and Teller to its family, and I think they want revenge. But for now, they are content just watching and waiting for the opportune moment.